So I joined the working world in September 2021, and I had no idea what to expect. So if you are starting work for the first time this summer or September, then stick around in this video because hopefully I can give you some insight into what to expect. Welcome back everyone. If you're new, my name is James and I'm currently a 5th year mechanical engineering student at the University of Nottingham, but last year I was on placement as a project engineering manager in the food manufacturing industry, and this gave me some really helpful insight into the working world. Now the first thing is that there are real world consequences, but also real world rewards that directly relate to the things that you do, and that is particularly a difference to university. So at university you'll have many courseworks, group projects, exams, but what is the worst case scenario if these go wrong? Probably that you will fail and maybe have to retake the exam or the coursework, but that's probably the worst case. But what about work? So let's take a hypothetical situation. Say you were meant to be planning a presentation for an important client meeting, but you forgot that this was happening and you had to whip it up in one evening. And because you were whipping it up last minute in the evening, you were quite tired, you might have missed a couple of details, maybe you put the wrong costs into the presentation and you just overall rushed it to try and get something done for the next day. And the next day rolls around and you have this meeting with this potential new client, and the new client can tell that you were unprepared and there's some dodgy information in there. And at the end of the meeting they decide, thank you, but no thank you, I don't want to work with you. Now let's say this gets back to your boss and they find out that because of your unpreparedness, they've not only lost out on potential future income for the company, but you could also risk losing your job. And even this is a sort of medium, middle of the road consequence. In many other jobs, if people make bad decisions or are lazy or ignore certain things, the worst case scenario can often be serious injury or death. But there are also some more low-key examples, of which I have quite a few from my year on placement. So let me tell you one of them now. On my first project, I was in charge of the project plan, or the Gantt chart, or the program, whatever you want to call it. And we had some issues with one of the contractors that meant that we had to report a delay to our client, which is never good news. So I had to produce a new plan that would show realistically when the project would be completed. So I worked really hard on Microsoft Project until it was done and dusted, and then I converted it into PDF form, sent it off to the client and my project team, and I thought, job well done. The next Monday rolled around and my supervisor and my boss had a conversation with me about the formatting of this plan. Now, I stupidly failed to double check my work before I submitted it, and it turns out when I looked at it, it was absolutely awful. You could barely read any of it because there were about 400 tasks split across multiple pages that spanned to the right and down, and it was just almost impossible to read. And naturally, the client wasn't too pleased, and apparently he called up my supervisor to say it's not good enough. And this is an example of a real world situation where I've not done well enough and it's directly impacted sort of the client and been unhappy with it. And thankfully, because I was new, my supervisor and boss were very patient with me. I learned a lesson that day. These are all examples of consequences at work, but there are also rewards from real work. So I think that because there is real money, real jobs, real people at stake when you're doing a real project, that when you successfully complete a project, there's so much more satisfaction when you get to the end and you say, we've done it. We've created these more jobs. We've created this new product. We've created the ability to feed more people, or whatever it is. It's so much more satisfying when you complete a project as compared to university. When we produced the first food on my first ever project, you could not wipe the grin off my face on that day that we produced our first stock. And while we're on the subject of rewards, you can also get obviously financial rewards because you're working for money. Now it does depend on the company, but you can get things like bonuses and little treats and things like that. So I guess keep an eye out for that in your company. That is an extra little bonus that you might get. Now before we move on to the second point, if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like and maybe even subscribe if you want to join this community where I'm talking a lot about work and rest. It would mean a lot to me and it would help me to share this message with more people. It's also completely free to join. Now the second point is that it's actually a lot harder to stay healthy when you're in the working world. Before I went on placement, when I was in the early years of my university degree, I was able to go to the gym in the middle of the day, go for a run if I got bored. I could even go and play games like spikeball, frisbee, rugby with my mates in the garden in the middle of the day. And Most of these activities, funnily enough, happen between 9 and 5, which is obviously when you'd normally be working in the working world. Now, I know a lot of companies these days have more flexible working schedules. I was talking to one of my friends who said that one company says that you must work between the hours of 10 and 12 and 2 and 4, and you also must get your 8 hours per day. But the rest is up to you how you structure it. So that means that if you started work an hour earlier, say, you could take an extra hour over your lunch break and use that to exercise and eat and relax a bit. So, you know, we are moving towards a slightly more flexible working way in a lot of companies. Now, in my job when I was on placement, we were also fairly flexible. However, because we worked with other clients, each client is different and they all have their own expectations of how much you should be working and when you should be working, especially because they are the ones that are paying. For example, one company might be far more strict and say you absolutely must be working and available during the entire period between 9 and 5, and other companies might be a bit more relaxed and have this approach of maybe start a bit earlier, have a bit of a break in the middle of the day. So it can be complicated, and it was a little bit complicated for me when I was on my placement. Our policy was kind of giving our employees, so effectively me, the discretion to decide what was appropriate with regard to how they'd balance their work, but also with some key boundaries in place, such as you have to obviously work the hours that you're paid for, which was 40. You also have to be available obviously for meetings when they're in place. For example, if a client says, oh, can we have a progress update meeting tomorrow at 10, and you say, oh no, sorry Jeff, I've got a spin class at 10, can't make it. That won't fly. But what we have said is that if your plate is relatively clear, you can go for a little dog walk or go out for a bit of a run, as long as you're keeping track of your hours and, most importantly, making sure that your team is aware of what you're doing so they can work around you. Now, the third point is that work stress, or stress induced by work, is often a lot more real and difficult than stress induced by university. So I was lucky enough to pretty much be working on one project almost my entire placement year, and I got to see it go from a concept all the way through to completion, which was awesome. I obviously cannot say who the client was, but what I can say is obviously it's in the food manufacturing industry, and that is vaguely relevant. So the project was at a stage where effectively what we were trying to do was expand a production area that was a certain size and basically double its size. So what we had to do was sort of break into an existing wall, and they use white walls in the food manufacturing industry, and we had to effectively cut into it, pull it down, and then put up a temporary wall so that we could sort of protect that production area so they could keep making food whilst we had a construction site on the other side. So there's this sort of boundary separating construction, which is really messy and dirty, and a really clean food production area that needs to stay at a high standard. So as I said, there was this temporary wall that had to stand up, and it had these legs that would support it. And on one side, the clean side, you had a big machine that would run along the floor that was obviously producing this food. And the client naturally was saying, we need room to operate this safely. You can't have a wall right up against the machine. So we were sort of trying to create room for them to be able to produce food. However, on the other side, if you think about it, you've just ripped out a wall. So your floor has got a hole in it, and your ceiling's got to be patched up to join to the new ceiling. So effectively, we had to balance this client that really wanted to run their line, and we had to balance this construction sort of team erring to try and get their sort of floor filled in and their ceiling patched up. And sadly on this day, my senior manager and the client project manager were both on holiday, so I was effectively the one sort of responsible for this situation, and it's a really tricky situation. And you know, I did my best. I tried to balance the client, I tried to balance the contractors and get them to work together, and ultimately we had to stop running the line for the afternoon, which sounds like not a big deal, oh it's just one afternoon, but if you think about it, if one production line isn't producing food, then that's money that they are not going to be getting. And these production lines produce a lot of food, and therefore quite a lot of money can be lost. So it is a real world consequence, and that can increase your stress a lot. It also didn't help that this all happened on like a Friday afternoon. And if you know anything about construction projects, you'll know that you do not want these kind of things to go wrong on a Friday afternoon when everyone's egging to try and get out the door at 1, 2 p.m. It's the worst things to go wrong, and that's when this all happened. So all of this built up to just be quite a lot of stress, which I had to handle and deal with, and it was quite tough. Now, I'm not just going to leave you with it's super stressful, good luck. I have actually made a full video about how I've coped with all this, and many more stories that I talk about, such as people having fights in my morning meetings, and also our whole site losing power and us running around trying to figure out what was causing this. So I've made a video about it, and if you fancy watching, it might help you to figure out how you can cope with the stresses of the working world. And if all this stuff is interesting you as well, I also made a video that was the 12 lessons I learned from my first 12 months of work, which I think, and I've watched back a couple of times, is actually quite helpful for anyone who's starting work. So I strongly recommend you check that out as well. So if you really enjoyed this video and you love this sort of area of learning more about how to work and rest effectively, how to manage stress and all these things, then please join me and subscribe and keep an eye on the videos that I upload. I'll be talking all about this area, more from a place of showing you how I've sort of coped and done things, not from a place of, oh, this is how you must do it, you know, this is the only way.
This is the way.
So please consider subscribing if you would find that useful, and if you've made it this far, thank you so much, I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video.